Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about alternative classroom environments. My name is Kathleen Sharkey. I currently teach at Hinsdale Central High School. To start my action research project, I really wanted to dig deep into the three different alternative classroom environments: an online classroom, a blended classroom, and a flipped classroom. My purpose was to determine the pros and cons of each of these learning environments and determine the success students have in each of these learning environments. This was really inspired by the pandemic, where I was kind of forced and expected to try teaching in different classroom environments. Some major concerns that not only I have, I think other educators have with switching from a traditional learning environment to an alternative learning environment is the lack of resources and technology issues. I know we have all been there when Canvas is down or Google is down or Zoom doesn't work. Something happens, so it can cause, us as teachers to have a ton of backup plans. Furthermore, a big concern of mine when I was transitioning to this was losing the face-to-face interaction. It's a lot easier to hide behind a camera than it is to participate face-to-face. So that was one of my biggest concerns. And another is the teacher buy-in. So we all are individuals. We all have a lot of different personalities and things we bring to the table as educators. And in order for this to be successful, there has to be teacher buy-in. My research questions, there was 3 of them. What are the pros and cons of an online, blended, and flipped classroom, and how do they affect students in the classroom? How are students successful in these learning environments, and what type of training is necessary for educators to consider transitioning to these learning environments? For me to continue forward, I think all 3 of these played a big role when I started to dig deep into my own research, but I think moving forward, these 3 are going to be huge components as well. For my literature review, I reviewed 3 different peer-reviewed articles. The first one was by Hu, Jia, Ganda, and Bai, written in 2020. And the big thing about this article is they talked about a flipped classroom in a large public Asian university. They were mainly working in a flipped classroom, and their whole goal was to determine what was student performance and the learner performance in the flipped classroom compared to the traditional classroom, as well as what good practices came from performing this flipped classroom. Another article I digged deep into was Clark Kaw and Besterfield's Scars in 2016. Here they described how to determine the effectiveness of a blended, semi-flipped, and flipped classroom. They found that most students desired to have the blended. It allowed for a little bit more of a traditional sense as well as that face-to-face interaction. And the last study I looked at was Weldy in 2018, where they examined students' preferences, their experiences, and the different techniques and tools that are necessary or helpful in the blended, flipped, and alternative learning environments. This was done to business students at a university, and overall, unfortunately, students preferred that traditional learning environment. So after reviewing my literature reviews, I really they were very oriented for a higher level of education. So I really wanted to dig deep into my own high school experience. So I picked some of my classrooms that I've done in the past. So in the spring of 2020, my Algebra 1 and my Geometry class were taught online. This was due to the pandemic. We shut down in March of 2020 and we did not return to the classroom. So everything was taught online. In the fall of 2020, starting the new school year, I chose to teach my Algebra 1 class as a flipped classroom. So students were expected to watch videos at home and take some notes and complete an activity at home, just a little formative assessment to give me some data on how they did with the notes. And then in class, we would discuss the results from the formative assessment as well as identify any questions students had, and then we practiced. And the last data set I decided to choose from was from this previous school year. In the spring of 2021, it was a geometry class and it was taught blended. So some things I found in my Algebra 1 and my geometry class in the spring of 2020 during the pandemic. This was taught completely online. I have my students' grades, so you can see that the ones in blue are my students, how many students received an A in the traditional learning environment, a B, a C, a D, and an F, as well as in the orange is their grades during the online environment. So overall, my students did a little bit better. I have more A's, more B's, less C's and less D's, most likely because they have moved into that from a B to a C, or from a C to a B and a B to an A. I also have my students complete reflections throughout the semester. The main one that I use is Google Form, and right at the end, I took some of their own words. So these are things that students discussed, as well as at the end I had them rate themselves and kind of express how much they worked during that environment. So students expressed they really enjoyed working at their own pace. Their anxiety level was a lot down. They felt a lot less pressured. I think during the pandemic, really, we had to be as flexible as possible, so that could have hopefully eased a lot of their stress. Many enjoyed the independence, especially if we're so-called a college prep school. This independence and that skill is so important for future, as well as in their work field. Their workload was decreased, so they enjoyed that. When students rated how hard they worked throughout this online classroom, 31% said they worked as hard as they normally would. 31% expressed they did not work any harder at all. And 38% expressed they worked much harder. In the fall of 2020, I had my Algebra 1 flipped classroom, so I had my students reflect through Kami this time. And a majority of my students felt successful and enjoyed the flipped classroom. In the orange there is where they felt indifferent. The gray is where they preferred traditional. And the yellow is they did not feel successful at all and hated the flipped classroom, which fortunately was very low. Throughout the reflections, they also expressed I had them give advice to future students in a flipped classroom, and these are some things they said. How important it is to stay on top of the videos. Do not be afraid to pause, rewind, take notes. Throughout each of the videos, ask questions in class before jumping into practice. Work with your group. That was a huge thing. An overall pattern I saw is they said when they worked together, it was much easier for them to get stuff done a lot quicker. And then my last data set came from my geometry blended classroom this past spring. 54% determined it was difficult to stay focused when learning from home. 26% preferred learning from home and found it easy to focus. 20% felt indifferent. I also had them rate their work ethic that they thought. 74% expressed they worked harder than normal during blended learning. 16% they worked an average amount. And 10% considered themselves slackers and did not put in a ton of effort. I really appreciate how honest my kids were throughout this process. I know their flexibility was so important as well as mine throughout this. For my future action plan, my goal is to still determine the benefits and the disadvantages of an online flipped and blended classroom. My overall objectives for the future is to prove students' success in each of these learning environments, find the pros and cons of each of these, and determine what tools are necessary for teachers to consider using these moving forward. The driving forces that are behind this are my qualitative and my quantitative data. I never realized how important qualitative data is. It really has helped me give the students a voice and hear their feedback right away and determine the patterns that I can see. As well as the quantitative data, this really helps me track the student success in each of the learning environments. Some restraining forces that will occur are the parent, student, and administration pushback. I think especially after this pandemic, everyone kind of wants things to go back to normal, but there are certain things that we cannot control. And one thing I cannot control is how others will respond to these. And another thing is the teacher buy-in. We cannot force people to teach a certain way. Everyone has the freedom of some sort to run their classroom how they want it, and it is their own. And it's really personal for a lot of people, so you have to have those conversations and be gentle about other people's opinions. For my future action plan moving forward, I think I'm going to need multiple trials and sources, a much larger sample. I think across content would be awesome, so people outside of my math class or my math world would be really helpful. Like, how does it change in a history class? How does it change in a PE class, etc.? I need a control group and an experimental group. I think having one group just be taught a traditional way, and then our experimental group be taught either in a blended, flipped, or online classroom. And we'll look at their final exam results for some quantitative data in both environments, and then as well as give surveys throughout to get some qualitative data. Overall, our learning never ends. Each environment brought a variety of benefits, which I was able to discover, but with our education continuing to grow, there's just not one answer. This action plan, in order to have a more definitive, like, this is the one you need to choose, I have to continue exploring and hearing from my students and seeing what happens. So thank you for coming, and have a great day. To fully wrap up, here is a copy of my references. And then finally, I like to leave with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt: "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." And I really believe that my dream is to teach students, and it's a huge passion of mine. So as I continue this research, I hope that I will continue to grow and find more reliable sources, have more validity, as well as get more teachers involved. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.